Hey folks, my name's Ed Travers. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I'm an Anglican priest serving in the beautiful parish of St. Margaret of Scotland that sits on the ancestral and on the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Gwe. We're going to continue talking about Moses the Black. If you saw the video from last week, Moses the Black was that 4th century Egyptian monk / priest from Ethiopia who wasn't always a monk / priest, but rather was a bandit, a robber, a highwayman, a man of great violence. This guy was huge and zealous for God. When he came to find his faith, when he converted and chose to give his life over to Christ, to walk with the Master, to be as Christ in the world, he meant it. He was a definite believer. He didn't do anything sort of halfway. When he gave himself to something, he gave himself to something. So when he decided to give himself to Christ, he meant it. Even though at times it was going to put him in really confusing and challenging situations, intellectually, spiritually, not just physically. Right? This guy, because of the way he approached life, he found the monastic life a real challenge. It wasn't easy for him. Things were not just simply cut and dry. The story I'm going to share with you today is one that I found. The abbot of his monastery had ordered everybody to fast. They were all going to go without food. They were probably, or at least they were going to go without food during the sunlight hours, whatever their fasting ritual had been. But they were all going to fast. That was the order. And the abbot, he called the shots. So all the monks, all the people in the monastery, they're going without food. They're hungry. They're probably annoyed. They're probably feeling a little bit irritated because that's what happens when our bodies go without food. Some visitors came. Some visitors came to the monastery, some other monks. And when they arrived, remember, they hadn't heard this order. They're not part of this monastery. They were travelers. They were passing through. And because they came to the gates, Moses, he let them in, because that's what you do. And when they arrived, he probably, from tradition, probably washed their feet, made them comfortable, gave them a place to clean up, because that's what you do. And you can imagine, as people of love and hospitality, you can imagine the next thing that he would have done. That's right. He would have fed them. And so he started cooking breakfast. He started cooking, literally cooking breakfast for in the monastery, but he started preparing a meal for them. Of course, some of his fellow monks in that monastery, they weren't pleased. They ran off to the abbot. Moses is cooking a meal. He's feeding people. You gave us an order not to feed anybody, but he's out there feeding people. He's breaking your rules. The abbot, he doesn't know what's going on. Him and those complaining monks, off they go. They're going to talk to Moses. And when they get there, the abbot recognizes that he doesn't recognize who these monks are. He recognizes these people are travelers. And he says to Moses, he says, you're breaking my rule. You're disobeying my orders. But it is so that you may keep a much more important command. The commands of hospitality. The rules of hospitality. Moses chose, he easily could have said, listen guys, I'm sorry, I'd love to cook you a meal, but we can't. We're not eating here today. There's an order. There's a fasting order, and since you're here, you now need to follow it. But he didn't. He could have done that, but he did not. He chose instead to recognize that these guys had been traveling. They were probably very hungry. They probably went without for a long time, or at least long enough to be in need of a meal, and he gave them a meal. He recognized that it was the right and loving thing to do for his neighbors, was to offer them the hospitality of his home. There are times, especially in the church, And again, it's not simple. It is complicated from the perspective that we have to be willing to weigh God's command versus a human ordinance, a human doctrine, a human canon, a human law, a human rule, a human order. God's commands come first. God's commands come first when we see a conflicting order from the church. God's commands come first when we see a conflicting order from community, from family. God's commands come first when we experience a conflicting order from the episcopate, from our episcopal authority. God's commands come first even when we see the Bible, when we see the commands of the Bible. God's command is love one another. In everything we do, we must be certain we are always, 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 always following that command, that law. Are you loving your neighbors? Are you giving to your neighbors? Are you taking care of them? That one law trumps all other laws because through that one law, we live another incredibly important law, which is to love God with all our heart, mind, soul, and body. Through that one law, we ensure that we are following all the other commandments that are given to us in the Old Testament. Through that one law, through the obedience to that one law, we are living in obedience to all that Jesus calls us to. And furthermore, by living according to that one law, because that one law transcends religion, it transcends belief, it transcends faith, it transcends worship, it transcends theology. If we are all living in obedience to that one law, we are all living in unity together. Moses, that day, the abbot recognizes that despite the fact that he's breaking the abbot's command, the abbot's order, he's literally being disobedient to what the monastery, what the order was trying to achieve. Moses was living up to something that was much more important. He was doing so unabashedly. He was doing so without fear. He was doing so because he actually believed what this was all about. He was doing so because he had given himself to Christ, and he was willing to pay a consequence if the abbot had so deemed him to be in violation of that fasting order. Christ came first. Caring for others came first. Love came first. May the Lord bless you. May the Lord keep you. May the Lord's face be made to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord's countenance be lifted up to you. May you always know the peace of being in the Lord's presence. And I pray that we would be as courageous as Moses, that we would be willing to do what needs to be done according to God's great command, that we would always be willing to love our brothers and sisters regardless of the human rules that are around us. Amen. Nemultus.